The cold arrived without drama, without warning bells or speeches. It came the way it always does on the northern plains, quietly at first, then all at once. By mid-January, the Dakota Territory was locked beneath a sky the color of dull steel. The wind did not howl yet. It waited. Temperatures slipped below zero and kept falling, not by degrees, but by resolve. Each night erased what little warmth the day had managed to restore. In the settlement, log cabins crouched low against the prairie, their walls thin, their chinks stuffed with rags and dried grass. Inside, families fed their stoves relentlessly. Fires roared bright and loud, consuming wood faster than it could be replaced. Buckets of water froze solid, even when set only a few feet from the hearth. Frost traced white veins across interior walls like creeping vines. Men woke every 2 hours to stoke the fire. Women slept in coats. Children learned early that winter was not a season, it was an opponent. This was the kind of cold that punished hesitation, the kind that cracked trees like gunshots, the kind that turned simple mistakes into funerals by morning. And yet, on the edge of the settlement, there was one place where the cold did not rule. No roaring fire lit the night sky there. No smoke poured endlessly from a chimney in desperate defiance. No one paced the floor counting how many logs remained before dawn. In that dwelling, a single man sat in quiet stillness, dressed in his shirt sleeves. His fire was little more than glowing embers. The air around him was calm, warm, steady, as if the winter outside had somehow forgotten he existed. The neighbors called his home many things. A foolish experiment, a damp hole, a grave with a roof. They said he was wasting months of labor on something no sensible person would trust with their life. They warned him the earth would swallow him. That stone would crack. That moisture would freeze him from the inside out. But the cold does not care about opinions. It only reveals the truth. And on this winter night, when the thermometer slipped past 30 below zero, the truth was about to become impossible to ignore. Because survival on the frontier was never about who built the biggest fire. It was about who truly understood how heat moves, and who had been fighting the wrong enemy all along. And that is where this story truly begins. On the frontier, survival knowledge spread fast, but it did not always spread wisely. Most settlers believed they already understood winter. They had crossed rivers, broken sod, raised cabins with their own hands. They trusted what had worked before, and what had been passed down by men who looked confident beside an axe and a stack of firewood. The rule seemed simple: big fire equals safety. More wood equals warmth. Thicker flames mean control. So cabins were built the same way, again and again. Logs stacked horizontally, gaps stuffed with mud or straw. Fireplaces set against exterior walls. High ceilings that felt spacious in summer and merciless in winter. When the cold arrived, the solution was always the same: burn harder. But no one stopped to ask where the heat was going. Warm air rushed upward, collecting uselessly near the ceiling before slipping out through cracks in the roof. Fresh, cold air crept in through every imperfect seam. Walls only a few inches thick bled warmth into the night. The fire roared, the room glowed. And still the floor stayed cold. Step away from the hearth, and the illusion vanished. This was not heat storage. It was heat consumption. The settlers mistook motion for progress. They believed constant effort meant effectiveness. If the fire demanded feeding every hour, that must be the price of survival. Exhaustion became normal. Smoke-filled air became acceptable. Interrupted sleep became tradition. They called it frontier toughness. But toughness is not the same as intelligence. What most of them had built were shelters that fought winter head-on, thin skins standing exposed against an 80-degree temperature difference. Inside was 60 degrees of human hope. Outside was lethal cold. And between the two stood nothing but wood and faith. No one questioned this design because everyone used it. Habit hardened into certainty. And certainty left no room for curiosity. When someone suggested a different approach, something quieter, slower, less dramatic, it felt wrong. Unmanly, unfamiliar, almost insulting to the idea of frontier grit. Why hide from winter when you could battle it? Because battle implies victory, and winter never loses. The mistake wasn't the fire. The mistake was thinking fire alone could win. The settlers believed they were heating space. They were really just chasing escaping air. And until someone challenged that assumption, they would keep burning their strength, their forests, and sometimes their lives, trying to overpower a force that did not need to be fought at all. The frontier rewarded effort, but it rewarded understanding even more. He did not arrive with speeches or ambition. The man came into the settlement quietly, as many immigrants did, carrying little more than a few tools, a weathered journal, and the habits of a life shaped elsewhere. His hands told the story before he ever spoke, broad palms, scarred knuckles, fingers shaped by years of stone and lime rather than axe and saw. Most assumed he would do what everyone else did. Join a crew. Stack logs. Raise walls quickly before winter returned. Instead, he walked to the edge of the settlement, chose a modest rise of land with southern exposure, and began to dig. Not a foundation. A hole. Day after day, the pit grew deeper. Earth piled beside it in neat mounds. 6 feet down, then more. The rear wall pressed directly into the soil itself. The sides took shape slowly, partly carved, partly built, each stone placed with patience that unsettled those who watched. People stopped to stare. Then they started to whisper. "He's burying himself alive," one woman said. "Digging his own grave," another replied. Children laughed. Men shook their heads. Even experienced builders frowned, unable to fit what they were seeing into anything they recognized as sensible construction. Cabins rose above ground. They always had. Shelter meant walls between you and the earth, not walls made of it. When asked why he wasn't building up, the man offered no long explanation. He simply kept working, measuring, adjusting angles, selecting stones as if each one mattered more than speed. There was something unsettling about that confidence. It wasn't stubbornness. It wasn't defiance. It was certainty, quiet, unadvertised, and deeply inconvenient to everyone else's assumptions. The ridicule came easily. A dugout was one thing. People had built temporary earth shelters before. But this was different. This was deliberate, permanent. The man wasn't hiding from winter. He was preparing for it. As summer turned toward fall, the shape of the shelter became harder to dismiss. Stone walls smoothed by hand, a curved ceiling taking form. Not flat, not peaked, but arched, like something borrowed from a different century. Warnings followed. Cold sinks, they told him. Moisture kills, they insisted. Stone collapses. They promised. He listened politely. He nodded. Then he went back to work. What they mistook for ignorance was memory. Because where he came from, winters were not fought with noise and flame. They were endured with patience, with mass, with designs that did not chase warmth but held it. The settlers believed he was rejecting frontier wisdom. In truth, he was carrying something older, a knowledge shaped by centuries of survival, quietly waiting for winter to prove its worth. And winter, as always, would be the final judge. What the settlers feared most about the ground was also what made it powerful. They believed cold lived in the earth, that frost crept upward from below, that digging down meant inviting winter closer to your bones. But nature does not work that way. Just a few feet beneath the surface, the earth becomes something entirely different. Not an enemy, not a threat, but a stabilizer. At a depth of 4 to 6 feet, soil no longer follows the violent swings of surface weather. It does not care if the air above plunges to 30 below zero or rises suddenly with a brief winter thaw. Down there, the temperature changes slowly, almost reluctantly. In the northern plains, that underground temperature holds steady around 50 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. Not warm, not cold, stable. This is something farmers knew without naming it. Root cellars kept vegetables from freezing in winter and spoiling in summer. Springs flowed unfrozen, even when everything above them locked solid. The ground, when left undisturbed, resisted extremes. Modern engineers would later call this phenomenon thermal lag, the delay between surface temperature changes and the Earth's response to them. But on the frontier, it was simply observed reality. The deeper you go, the quieter temperature becomes. While the settlers' cabins fought an 80 or 90-degree difference between inside and outside air, the buried shelter faced something far smaller. Its walls pressed against earth that already hovered near comfort compared to the killing cold above. The shelter was not trying to create warmth from nothing. It was borrowing stability from the planet itself. That difference mattered more than any fire. Cold moves toward warmth. Always. The greater the difference, the faster it moves. Thin wooden walls standing in open air lose heat relentlessly because the contrast is brutal. Human comfort on one side, deadly cold on the other. But when 3/4 of a structure is wrapped in earth that never freezes, heat has nowhere urgent to go. Instead of escaping, it lingers. Instead of rushing outward, it slows. Instead of demanding constant replacement, it waits. This is the mistake the settlers never questioned. They believed survival meant generating heat fast enough to outrun the cold. They never considered reducing the race itself. The man who dug downward wasn't trying to defeat winter. He was shrinking it. By placing his walls against soil that refused to freeze, he removed winter's greatest weapon, the temperature difference that drains warmth like blood from an open wound. The fire inside his shelter did not have to fight the sky. It only had to lift 50 degrees to comfort. And in that quiet mathematical truth lay the foundation of everything that followed. Fire is dramatic. Stone is patient. Most people confuse the two. On the frontier, settlers worshipped flame because it was visible. You could hear it roar. Feel it bite your skin. Watch it dance against iron and brick. When the fire burned hot, they felt safe. When it faded, fear returned. But fire itself does not store warmth. It only releases it. Stone does something different. Stone absorbs heat slowly, almost reluctantly. It does not react the way air does. It does not warm instantly, and it does not cool quickly either. Engineers would later describe this property as high specific heat capacity. But the principle is simple. Stone resists change. And resistance in winter is survival. When warmth enters stone, whether from a fire, from the earth, or from the bodies living within a space, it does not escape at once. It spreads inward, settling deep into the mass. Hours later, long after the flames have died down, that stored heat returns gently, radiating outward like a memory. This is why old masonry churches feel warm even when the furnace cycles off. Why stone cellars stay cool in summer and mild in winter. Why ruins can still hold warmth after sunset. The man building beneath the prairie understood this instinctively. He was not designing a shelter that depended on constant burning. He was creating a thermal reservoir. A heat battery charged slowly, discharged even more slowly. Above his head, the curved stone ceiling mattered as much as the walls. Not because it was heavy, but because it was continuous. Each stone pressed against the next, forming a single mass that could accept warmth from the small stove below and return it evenly across the space. Air heats unevenly. Stone does not. Air creates hot spots and cold corners. Stone smooths them out. The settlers' cabin spiked in temperature near the fire and froze everywhere else. But in a stone-lined shelter, heat moved differently. It soaked. It lingered. It stayed. The fire's role was no longer to overpower cold, but to gently charge the structure, like winding a clock instead of sprinting against time. This is why the shelter could feel warm even when the fire was barely alive. The warmth did not come from flame. It came from memory. Stone remembers what air forgets. That single insight changed everything. It meant fewer logs burned, fewer wake-ups in the night, less panic when the wind rose. Heat became something held, not something chased. The settlers looked at stone and saw weight. He looked at stone and saw time. And winter, relentless as it was, could not outrun patience. To frontier eyes, the shelter looked like a mistake taking shape. It had no tall walls, no proud roofline, no sense of upward ambition. Instead, it sank into the land, quiet and unassuming, as if it were trying not to be noticed. That alone unsettled people. Frontier buildings were meant to stand tall, to declare presence against a vast and hostile landscape. Height felt like strength. Visibility felt like control. Anything that disappeared into the earth seemed weak, even shameful. But winter does not reward pride. It rewards efficiency. The shelter's footprint was modest, rectangular, and deliberate. Not wide enough to waste heat. Not narrow enough to feel cramped. Every measurement served a purpose. There was no excess volume to warm. No unused air collecting near the ceiling. The walls were partly carved from the earth itself, partly built upward with stone where excavation ended. This hybrid approach mattered. Earth-backed walls eliminated exposure on three sides, while stone provided strength, durability, and thermal mass where it counted most. Then there was the roof, the feature that drew the most criticism. Instead of beams and planks, the ceiling curved. Not sharply, but gently, forming a continuous stone vault. Each stone leaned into the next, transferring its weight sideways and downward, not straight down. This wasn't defiance of gravity. It was cooperation with it. Flat roofs sag. Peaked roofs push outward. Arches compress. That compression locked the structure together. The roof did not rely on wood to hold weight. It relied on geometry. Snow load. Earth load, even time itself, pressed the stones tighter into place. The more weight above, the more stable the vault became. On top of that stone ceiling, earth was piled thick, not as decoration, but as protection. 2 full feet of soil shielded the vault from wind, temperature shock, and sudden freezes. It slowed the movement of cold the same way it slowed heat loss below. This earth layer also solved another frontier problem: water. Sloped carefully, it shed rain and melting snow away from the structure instead of allowing it to seep inward. Moisture, the silent killer of winter shelters, never gained a foothold. Inside, the ceiling rose just high enough for comfort. No wasted height. No cavernous space demanding endless heat. Warm air had nowhere to flee. It curved along the stone overhead and stayed within reach. Everything about the design offended common sense, until you followed the logic. The shelter did not try to dominate the environment. It adapted to it. It used mass instead of muscle, shape instead of speed, restraint instead of excess. What looked like a compromise was actually precision, and as winter approached, that precision would prove more powerful than any roaring fire ever could. The settlers believed the fire was the heart of the home. They built their lives around it, placing stoves at the center of rooms, feeding them constantly, watching the flames as if attention alone could make warmth last. When the fire burned bright, they felt secure. When it faded, anxiety returned. But fire was never the hero of winter survival. It was only a trigger. In most cabins, heat rose straight upward from the stove, gathering uselessly near the ceiling before escaping through the roof or slipping out through cracks in the walls. The hotter the fire burned, the faster warmth rushed away. The solution always seemed to be more fuel, more effort, more exhaustion. The buried shelter treated the stove differently. It was not placed at the center, but offset, tucked deliberately into a corner of the space. This was not an accident. It was geometry and gravity working together. When the stove released heat, warm air rose and curved naturally along the stone vault overhead. The ceiling guided it, not upward and away, but outward and across. As the air cooled, it descended gently along the opposite wall, completing a slow, invisible loop. No fans, no force, just physics. This quiet circulation distributed warmth evenly instead of concentrating it in one spot. There were no scorching corners and no frozen shadows. The space warmed as a whole, not in patches. The stone walls played their part. They absorbed excess heat while the fire burned and returned it later, preventing sudden temperature swings. The shelter did not overheat when the stove was active, and it did not collapse into cold when the fire died down. Ventilation, another fear of the settlers, was equally intentional. Fresh air entered low, where it was coolest. As it moved inward, it passed near the stove, warming naturally before rising. Moist air exited slowly through the chimney and a small upper vent, carrying breath and smoke away without creating drafts. There was air movement, but no wind. Breathing, but no chill. This balance solved 2 deadly problems at once. It kept moisture from condensing and freezing on walls, and it prevented the stagnant, smoke-filled air that caused sickness in so many frontier homes. The fire, in this system, worked only briefly each day. Its job was not to dominate the space, but to charge it, like winding a clock that would run long after the hand stopped moving. This was the difference the settlers could not see. They were heating air. He was heating mass. Air forgets heat the moment it escapes. Stone remembers. And once you understand that, the stove no longer needs to roar. It only needs to whisper. Winter did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived the way it always did on the northern plains, first with silence, then with violence. The barometer dropped for days. Old men watched the sky and said little. Birds vanished. The wind paused, as if gathering strength. By nightfall, snow began to fall straight down, heavy and soundless, muffling the settlement beneath a false calm. Then the temperature collapsed. In a matter of hours, it plunged past 0 and kept going. By midnight, the cold had teeth. By dawn, it would have names. Numbers whispered in disbelief. Inside the log cabins, panic replaced routine. Stoves were fed until iron glowed dull red. Men woke every hour, sometimes every 30 minutes, to throw in more wood. Smoke thickened the air. Frost bloomed along interior walls despite the fires roaring only a few feet away. Water buckets froze solid. Breath crystallized in the corners of rooms. Children slept in shifts near the stove, blankets piled dangerously close to flame. The cold pressed inward like a living thing, finding every weakness, every crack, every mistake. Wood disappeared fast. What had seemed like a generous supply days earlier now looked fragile. Each log burned felt like a small surrender. Some families realized, too late, that their piles would not last the night. Across the settlement, axes rang in darkness as men split frozen wood by lantern light, hands numb, lungs burning. This was frontier winter at its most honest. No romance, only endurance. At the edge of the prairie, the buried shelter remained quiet. No frantic footsteps. No bursts of smoke. No glow of desperation against the night sky. Inside, the temperature barely moved. The stone walls released their stored warmth slowly, steadily. The curved ceiling radiated heat downward, not in waves, but in a constant, gentle presence. The air was calm, dry, still. The fire had burned earlier in the evening, modest and brief. Now it rested in embers, its work already done. While others fought the cold minute by minute, this shelter ignored it entirely. Morning came reluctantly. When settlers emerged from their cabins, faces drawn and eyes rimmed with smoke, they found a landscape transformed. Trees cracked in the distance with sharp reports like rifle shots. Livestock huddled motionless. The cold had not loosened its grip, it had tightened it. And still, the buried shelter gave no sign of struggle. That was when doubt began to crack something deeper than frozen wood. Because winter had done what argument never could. It had stripped away belief and left only results. And the results were impossible to ignore. By the second morning of the cold snap, the difference could be measured. Not in opinions, not in confidence, but in simple, unforgiving numbers. In the log cabins, firewood piles had shrunk at an alarming rate. Families counted logs the way sailors once counted rations, quietly, anxiously, already calculating how many hours each piece might buy them. Some cabins had burned through a week's supply in less than 48 hours. Inside those homes, temperatures told a cruel story. Near the stove, it might reach the low 50s for a brief moment. Step a few feet away, and the air dropped into the 30s. In corners, ice formed where breath condensed and froze against the walls. Heat existed, but only where the fire stood guard. Now compare that to the buried shelter. A simple mercury thermometer hung from a beam near the center of the space. It did not spike. It did not collapse. It hovered calmly in the low to mid-60s, barely shifting through the night, even as the outside temperature fell past 30 below zero. The firewood stack told the same story. While neighboring cabins burned 15, 20, sometimes 30 logs a day, the buried shelter consumed only a handful. For logs on a normal winter day. 6 during the worst of the cold. Not because the occupant was suffering, but because the structure no longer demanded constant feeding. The difference was not efficiency alone. It was scale. A conventional cabin fought an 80-degree temperature difference every minute of the night. Heat rushed outward as fast as it was created. The fire worked constantly and still lost ground. The earth-sheltered structure faced a far smaller challenge. Its walls pressed against soil that remained near 50 degrees. Its ceiling rested beneath earth and stone that resisted change. The fire did not race the cold. It simply nudged the temperature upward and let the mass do the rest. Even when the fire died down completely, the interior temperature fell slowly. So slowly that it never became uncomfortable. Sleep went uninterrupted. There was no need to rise in darkness, no desperate stoking, no panic. Moisture never appeared. Walls stayed dry. Air stayed fresh. These were not subtle improvements. They were orders of magnitude apart. One design consumed fuel just to survive. The other conserved fuel while offering comfort. One exhausted families. The other allowed them to rest. The settlers had believed winter demanded constant effort. The numbers told a different story. Winter demanded understanding. And understanding, once proven, is difficult to argue with. Winter has a way of stripping things down to what matters. By the third day of relentless cold, exhaustion replaced certainty. Men who had once spoken confidently about frontier toughness now moved slowly, shoulders hunched, eyes dulled by smoke and sleepless nights. The rhythm of survival, cut wood, feed fire, wait, repeat, had become a trap with no exit. It was no longer a question of comfort. It was a question of endurance. That was when the visits began. Not announced, not proud, just quiet footsteps approaching the southern-facing entrance of the buried shelter. At first, they came alone, one man at a time, hat in hand. breath visible in the air. They stood awkwardly, unsure how to ask what pride had forbidden them to consider days earlier. When the door opened, warm air rolled outward. Not the harsh blast of an overworked stove, but a steady, gentle warmth that felt almost unreal after days of fighting the cold. Faces changed instantly. Shoulders relaxed. Hands stopped trembling. Inside, there was no chaos. No smoke haze. No frantic feeding of fire. The stone walls were dry. The air was clear. The temperature even. This was not survival. This was control. Questions followed, hesitant at first, then urgent. How is it still warm? How much wood are you burning? How did you keep the walls dry? The answers were simple. That was what unsettled them most. There was no trick. No secret fuel. No heroic suffering hidden behind the design. Just principles, quiet, unglamorous, and brutally effective. As one visitor became 3, then 5, the tone shifted. The laughter that once followed the digging stopped. Jokes dried up. What replaced them was something rarer on the frontier than courage. Humility. Men who had built cabins in 3 territories stood silently, running their hands along stone walls that refused to freeze. Women who had lost sleep, and sometimes children, to bad winter air noticed how easy it was to breathe. Parents watched their hands warm without hovering over flame and understood something fundamental had been wrong before. No one argued anymore, because winter had already spoken. The buried shelter had not merely survived. It had exposed a flaw in the shared understanding of how homes should work. And once that flaw was visible, it could not be unseen. By nightfall, the question was no longer if this design worked. It was how many winters had been wasted fighting the wrong battle. What unsettled the settlement most was not the success of the buried shelter. It was the realization that this knowledge was not new. Nothing about the design was invented on the prairie. The principles had existed long before sawmills, long before standardized lumber, long before the idea that progress always meant building faster and higher. Stone, earth, and mass had sheltered people through centuries of winter, across Europe, across Asia, across mountain valleys where fuel was scarce and cold was merciless. These methods survived not because they were clever, but because they worked when nothing else did. So why had they been abandoned? The frontier rewarded speed. Cabins needed to rise quickly before the first snowfall. Timber was plentiful. Earth and stone required patience, planning, and skill that could not be rushed. A log cabin could be thrown together in weeks. An earth-sheltered home demanded months of careful labor. And speed became confused with progress. As railroads pushed west and sawmills followed, uniform materials replaced local wisdom. Lumber arrived pre-cut. Plans became standardized. Building turned into repetition instead of response to place. The question stopped being, what does this land demand? And became, what can we build the fastest? Even cultural memory shifted. Techniques passed down quietly within families were dismissed as old-fashioned. Earth shelters were labeled primitive. Masonry was seen as heavy, outdated, inefficient, despite evidence to the contrary. Convenience replaced resilience. The buried shelter challenged that assumption in the most uncomfortable way possible. It worked not because it was modern, but because it was adapted. It did not impose itself on the environment. It listened. Modern buildings often rely on constant energy input to remain livable. Remove that energy and comfort collapses quickly. The old designs assumed interruption. They assumed scarcity. They assumed winter would win if given the chance. So they built for patience. The settlers were not foolish. They were simply inheriting a narrow slice of tradition, one shaped by speed, availability, and appearance rather than longevity. The buried shelter reminded them that history is full of solutions we stopped using not because they failed, but because they asked more of us. More thought, more restraint, more time. Old does not mean obsolete. Often, it means tested, survived long enough to be forgotten by those who no longer needed it, until winter returned to remind them why it mattered. What the settlers witnessed that winter would take science decades to explain with charts and equations. But eventually it did. Long after the frontier closed and the prairie filled with roads and wires, engineers began rediscovering what stone and earth had quietly known all along. Studies confirmed that buildings surrounded by soil experience dramatically reduced heat loss. Structures with high thermal mass maintained stable interior temperatures with far less energy input. The language changed. The principles did not. Researchers began measuring heat flow instead of simply counting fuel. They documented how earth-sheltered homes reduced heating demand by more than half in cold climates, how thick masonry walls smoothed temperature swings, how reduced surface exposure mattered more than insulation alone. In laboratories and universities, these findings were labeled innovative. On the frontier, they had been practical. Modern materials refined the idea. Concrete replaced hand-cut stone. Vapor barriers solved moisture concerns. Passive solar design added another layer of efficiency. But none of these advancements replaced the core insight. Work with the earth, not against it. The buried shelter had reduced the problem of winter before solving it. By minimizing the temperature difference a structure needed to overcome, it transformed heating from a constant struggle into an occasional adjustment. This was the opposite of modern excess. Instead of overpowering nature with machinery, it redirected natural forces gently and persistently. Even today, buildings that rely solely on mechanical heating remain vulnerable. Power failures, fuel shortages, system breakdowns remove the inputs and comfort vanishes within hours. High-mass, earth-integrated structures respond differently. They buy time, sometimes days. Time matters in winter. The lesson was not that technology was unnecessary. It was that technology worked best when layered on top of timeless design rather than used to compensate for poor fundamentals. The settlers did not need equations to understand this. They felt it in their bones as they stepped from freezing cabins into calm, warm stone rooms. Their bodies recognized stability before their minds could name it. Science eventually agreed. And in that agreement lies a quiet warning. Progress does not always mean abandoning the past. Sometimes it means finally understanding why the past worked so well. The greatest change was not measured in degrees. It was measured in sleep. In the log cabins, winter never truly left the room. Even when the fire burned high, the cold waited at the edges, under beds, along walls, inside breath. Nights were fractured into anxious intervals. Bodies learned to rest lightly. Listening for the moment the fire demanded attention again. That kind of cold reshapes people. Children grow restless. Adults become irritable. Illness lingers longer. Simple tasks feel heavier. The body spends energy not on living, but on defending itself. Inside the earth-sheltered homes, something unfamiliar returned. Silence. The ground absorbed sound the way it absorbed heat. Wind no longer screamed against walls. Boards no longer creaked and snapped as temperatures shifted. There was no constant reminder of danger pressing, just inches away. People slept through the night. Not collapsed sleep born of exhaustion, but deep, steady rest. The kind that lets the body recover instead of merely endure. Parents woke clearer. Children stopped waking in fear. Even the elderly, whose bones remembered every winter they had survived, moved with less stiffness. The air helped too. Dry enough to prevent frost, fresh enough to breathe without strain. No smoke haze burning eyes. No stale heaviness clinging to blankets. Lungs worked easily. Coughs faded. Warmth, when it is stable, becomes invisible. And that invisibility is its greatest gift. When people no longer fight their environment, their attention shifts outward. Conversations lengthen. Hands grow steady enough for careful work. Even tempers soften. Survival stops consuming every thought. This was the part no one had anticipated. The buried shelter did not just save fuel. It gave people back their minds. Winter remained outside, doing what it always did. But inside, life felt ordinary again. Predictable. Human. That quiet, sustained comfort did something frontier life rarely allowed. It reduced fear. And with fear reduced, resilience grew stronger than any roaring fire ever could. The frontier was never conquered. That idea came later, written by those who arrived after the hardest lessons had already been paid for in blood and cold. The men and women who truly lived on the edge of survival understood something different. Nature does not yield. It responds. The people who lasted were not the strongest, nor the loudest, nor the most defiant. They were the ones who paid attention, who noticed patterns, who stopped trying to force outcomes and instead shaped their lives around what the land allowed. Winter was the clearest teacher. You could not intimidate it with fire. You could not outwork it with exhaustion. You could only reduce its power over you by understanding how it moved, how heat traveled, how cold invaded, how materials behaved when pushed to their limits. The buried shelter did not represent escape from hardship. It represented alignment. It accepted gravity instead of fighting it. It embraced mass instead of rejecting weight. It relied on patience instead of urgency. These were not romantic choices. They were practical ones. Frontier wisdom was never about heroics. It was about removing unnecessary struggle, about conserving energy, both human and material, so that life could continue when conditions were at their worst. Modern thinking often celebrates domination, bigger machines, stronger systems, faster solutions. But the frontier offered a quieter truth. The most effective designs rarely announce themselves. They work in the background. They endure. They ask less over time, not more. This lesson extends far beyond winter shelters. It applies to how communities form, how resources are managed, how people age within the environments they create. Those who learned this lesson passed it quietly to the next generation. Those who didn't often paid the price repeatedly, convinced each time that the struggle was unavoidable. The frontier did not reward stubbornness. It rewarded humility. And humility, when paired with understanding, proved stronger than pride in every season that followed. When the cold finally loosened its grip, the prairie looked the same as it always had. Snow melted slowly. Woodpiles stood thinner. Cabins bore the quiet scars of a hard winter, warped boards, cracked timbers, soot-stained walls. Life moved forward, because on the frontier it always had to. But something fundamental had changed. The buried shelter remained where it was, half hidden in the earth, unchanged by the storm that had broken so many assumptions. Its stone walls held steady. Its warmth lingered, not because winter had been defeated, but because it had been understood. That was the lesson winter offered, if one was willing to accept it. Progress does not always mean moving upward. Sometimes it means going deeper. The people who survived longest on the frontier were rarely the ones who fought nature hardest. They were the ones who listened, to the land, to materials, to patterns older than any single lifetime. They learned where effort mattered and where it was wasted. They learned that heat is not something you chase. It is something you hold. That wisdom never disappeared. It was simply buried beneath convenience, speed, and the illusion that newer always means better. Every generation has to rediscover it for themselves, usually when circumstances leave no room for arrogance. The prairie still grows cold every winter. The wind still searches for weakness. But beneath the surface, the earth remains patient. And so does the knowledge that once kept people alive when survival truly mattered. If this story changed the way you think about shelter, warmth, or the quiet intelligence of old solutions, take a moment to reflect on that. Not everything worth keeping announces itself loudly. Some of the strongest ideas work best when they stay unseen, doing their job year after year, asking little in return. This is the spirit of the frontier. Not conquest. Not defiance. Understanding. Stay warm out there. And remember, sometimes the smartest way forward is down.